Good morning. Learning is Chus Shlema Pilan Chai Basarach. We are on the bottom of Daf Samach Tes Amud Beis, like the last line. Boira. We're just gonna first. The Gemara is gonna ask a similar question to the last question, so we have to remind us of what we had spoken about before. The last thing we had talked about is whether you go basa the shirish, whether you go basa the ikr, the root, the main thing. Do you go basa? Do you go follow what grew later? That was in the case where someone planted wheat or tfua before the Eimer, and you have a whole grain of a whole ear of grain, and you planted it, and it grew, and then you cut it off before the Eimer came, and after the Eimer came, so it was kosher, right? If you have wheat that when the Eimer comes, because it's no longer kosher, it's to be eaten, and then he replanted after the Eimer, and then it continued to grow, grew a little bit more. So the question, do we say, well, certainly what grew afterwards is after the Eimer. Well, it was planted after the Eimer. What grew after the Eimer came from that planting. So that l'chayra, as we're going to see, is also. The question is, what about the first, which is mixed in? So it's gonna make the whole thing also. Does that first part, does that also have a din? Well, the point is, does that also get a din that it's us? In general, let's look at it that way. Let's look at it more generally. Is this thing usher because it has a chelik that grew afterwards, and we look at the new part. So we said that we brought rayas from Orla and from Klayim that we see we always we're gonna look after the new part. In those cases, it's going to be Lagabi Isser. Aimer is Mater, Klaya Kerem, and Arla, something that grows is Aser. So it says, since you have some new part that's Aser, we'll Aser the whole thing. But our question is over here, can you be Mater something based on the fact that the Iker of it, the Shirish, had already passed through Aimer and therefore became. So that was the Gemara's question. Now the Gemara is going to extend that question and ask it in other contexts. I mean, we said it in the case of Omer, we said in the case of Klein, we said in the case of Arla. Now we're going to ask Boy Rabba, the Indian Meiser. How does this work as far as Meiser? You have to take off a portion and give it to the Kohen, or Meiser has to go to Yushalayim. Hechidam. What's the case? Could go into Amdinu, Va'asrinu, Va'ashilnu, V'shasilnu. We're talking about where a person would made a umdana, because we're talking about whole ears of grain, a whole ear of, let's say, wheat or barley, as the case may be. And he said, usually what you do is you take the kernels off of the stalk, and then you have like a cup of wheat, and then you can do a tenth of that. Is pretty easy to calculate. You just take a cup, and you get 10 cups, and the 10th one is a tenth. When we talk about stalks of grain, if we have to say amdinu, you have to make an estimate because you can't really measure it as easily. Basranoni took off the mice already from these stalks that has a whole ear of grain on it. Then he replanted the ear of grain. He didn't replant it in the normal way. The normal way when you plant grain is you take the seed, you take off the kernels, and you put the kernels in the ground. He took the whole thing and stuck it back in the ground. Took the actual stalk and stuck it in the ground. By sifulahu, and it grew. The stalk, the grain on it grew after it was planted. I wouldn't have thought you could do such a thing, right? Doesn't seem like it. It's mamish take a stalk of ground that after you cut it and stick it in the ground that it should take root and grow. I guess yeah. It's like any other plant. It's like it was, yeah. So that's what he did.
Never experimented.
Right. So intim salayim alayasling basar if you'll say that we don't go after the main thing, which was already prior to, which already had Maisa taken, but Taisus boy Yishuri, and the Taisus is going to need to take Meiser off of it. The part that grew after you replanted it needs to have Meiser. But Ikamai, what's going to be? So now we've conceded that like we said in the previous Gemara, that we're not going to go bust it. We're going to go bust the Taisus. And Taisus is certainly what grew afterwards is going to need to have Meiser taken. But is that going to spread? Since it's all part of the same thing, I'm going to say the Iker also is going to, even though you already took Meiser, you're going to have to take Meiser a second time because it's sort of like infected with the new growth that did not have Meiser taken off of it. Amalei Abaya asked, how is this different than every single case where you plant grain of any kind, of wheat and barley that you plant? Because every time you plant it, you grow wheat one year, for example, and you cut the wheat and you thresh it and you make miruach, and then you take off meiser, and then you take some part of it and you plant it in the ground. So that part is always had already previously had meiser taken from it. Reminds me a little bit of the tax thing. Like you get taxed and you get taxed again. Just because you were taxed, and it doesn't mean you can't get taxed again. So you already had meiser taken off from the seeds that you put into the ground. So why isn't it that every year, when it comes time to do your harvest, you'll say, "Listen, I did that seed in the ground, so now I have a whole ear of stalk with a lot of wheat on it that I should be able to deduct. I only have to do, let's say, 99% is subject to meiser. But that one kernel that I had already taken meiser, I shouldn't get double taxation on it." Amalei, he said to him, "No, you can't compare it." And the truth is, it's not the case. We all know that's not the case. You just take meiser off of what grows. Amalei davash azari kalalami bayali. Says that, no, that's clearly a different situation. When you plant a grain, that grain doesn't exist anymore. It turns into the stalk. So that grain can't be. You can't say you have to deduct from this for that grain. That grain is dissolved. It's zari kala. It ended. Something like our case, where we said you took the actual stalk and stuck it in the ground, and then that stalk grew. So you still have the same stalk and the same grain on the stalk that was there originally. So the question is, does that get, like we said, infected by the chi of meiser of the new growth? Let's try to prove it from this case. Litra botzel, a measure of onions, shetiknai, that you took off the proper trumas and maisrus, vizare, and you planted it. Misaser. So when the way onions work, onions are always planted. It seems that the way they planted, you don't take a piece of onion. You take a tiny onion and you put it in the ground, and it grows into a big onion. I don't understand how this works, but it seems like at some point you're going to run out of onions. If every onion only makes one more onion, you won't have any. So where do all the onions come from? I don't know. Really, I'm a little confused about the metzias of it. Right? It says that a big onion comes from a small onion. Where did the small onion come from? Yeah. They don't help you so much in the art scroll with the background of the what do you call it? Agricultural details.
They're also not farmers.
Right. Right. So Zaktumara. Shetiknoi Vizara, and you planted it. You take Meiser on the whole thing. So you see that even though there was a portion that was there from the beginning, it was a small onion, it became a big onion, you still have to do Meiser even on that first part. And that Hasam Hainuzar, so over there's no Zari color. And even so, we say that the Iker also needs to have Meiser taken off. Hasam Hainuz Riyasai. Hachalav hainus riyasa. What it says you can't really compare because over there it's true that there is meiser even on the original portion, the original part of the onion that was there from the beginning, and it's not zarik pala, but this is the typical way of growing onions. You take a small onion, it grows into a big onion. But by wheat, taking a stalk and sticking it into the ground is not the typical way of growing wheat. So there's more reason to say that what was originally there, that already had mice taken off of it, it grew a little bit more, but that's not the normal way to make it grow. So maybe that original micer remains in place, and you don't have to take off micer again. Okay, so we leave it like that. Rav Chanina bar Menuni asked Abaya, what's the din by That's a pot, a growing pot. It doesn't have a hole in it. So the ground, the dirt in the pot, is not connected to the ground. So therefore, let's see what Rashi says. It's a very not clear statement. So Rashi said, "Kapar chashas iloy nakav ha loy nakav." They think they changed it. The Hagoyis V'tziyunim. Just iloy nakav miloy nakav. If you took off truma, we're talking about someone who took off truma from one pot of that you grew from another pot that also wasn't connected to the ground. A pot that is not connected to the ground, there's no din of trumas amaisus. The din of trumas amaisus is only in actual ground. If you grow like they did in Gaza, they used to have those hydroponic plants things to make. That's where we used to get our romaine lettuce from on Pesach. No, you don't remember about this?
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah. What was that place again? Gush Katif. Yeah, Gush Katif. So you grow something, it's not connected to the ground, you're not midaraisa, so you don't have to take off trumas amaisus. So this atzis she'ein enough of this pot that doesn't have a hole in it, there's no trumas amaisus. So if you have two pots that are both atzis she'ein enough, midarabanan is a chiyuv to take off trumas amaisus. If you took off from one, you had, let's say, 100 pounds of romaine lettuce from your two pots, and you took off 10% from one of the pots, it could go on the other because they're all in the same boat, so to speak. They all have the same rule. They're the same halacha applies to them, so they're equal. So you could take off from one thing that's equal to another. Zakmara, Eloi Nakov, Haloi Nakov. If it's not Nakov, that's not Nakov, meaning then there's no question about it. Obviously, that is the din. What's your question about this? Zakmara. So we have to understand it differently. We're not talking about two separate pots. We're talking about a pot that you grew in it. You grew a plant in it. You grew, let's say, wheat in it. And after it grew, so to some extent, you made a hole. And now it's connected to the ground. And then it grew more, which is very similar to our previous question. Does that new growth that needs Trumas Amaisis Medaraisa mean that the original growth that happened when it wasn't connected is it alternate? And Gemara, no, it's not really a comparison. Over here, it's all one growth. And it's just that it got connected and it kept on growing. But in our case, we had originally grown it before the Eimer. And it grew before the Eimer, and then you cut it off, and then you replanted it. That's not the same thing that was remained in its dirt, but it just, whether it was connected to Eretz Yisrael or not, its din changed. So maybe where it just its din changed, then we'll say that the new growth is not affected. But in our case, maybe we would say that the new growth would not cause the ikr to become asa. That would need a new item. Boyer bavo. She boilus shemircha bekri. Uh, a stalk of grain that you smoothed out in the granary, and which we know is the last stage where produce becomes mechoyev and trumas and maisis, the shasla, and after that he went um, and he replanted it. V'karlosh Hashem, um, and he said, I want this to become truma on some of the rest of the produce that I already have put into the kri that became subject of truma semais. Now, kivin the marcha tavula, since he already went past miruach, which we know makes your unprocessed grain now become processed grain that now is subject to truma semais, so it becomes tevel, and it needs to have truma semais taken off. Yikarlov shem kachala. So therefore, when you call it truma, it becomes truma. What do you say? Since he replanted it, you restart the clock, and now it needs another miruach to become subject to trumas and maisis and to become tevel again. If you're suggesting that he could actually take truma, that it still has its din, that it's tevel, and therefore it can be used as truma. So you've come up with a unique thing that a person can take truma while his grain is still planted. You have a Mishnah that says there's no such thing. Just says as a rule, there's no such thing that you could ever take truma from something that's attached to the ground. Amalei, no, you're misunderstanding what the Mishnah said when it said Lematzinu Truma B'Muchav Lekak. Kitanya Hila Inin Ichiyuve Misa V'Chaymish. It was saying that you can never be Mechoyev Misa B'Dei Shamayim and to pay the Chaymish for for eating truma. If a Yisrael eats truma, he's Chayev Misa, and he has to pay a Chaymish. It's saying not that you can't make something truma when it's Mechuv Lekaka, but it's saying you can never be mechuyev for eating truma illegally while it's attached to the ground. Why? The talish v'achel talish. If you're going to cut it off the ground, and it's not mechuyev lekaka anymore, so you're not proving this, you're not disproving this theory, this taina. V'gachem v'achel, and if he's going to bend down and eat it while it's still attached to the ground, that's not considered an achila. We say it's an unnatural achila, and therefore you can't be chayiv malchus. It's like when I just called up a Rav and asked about, I have a freezer that has little, it shows the temperature in tenths of a degree on it, on the outside. You open the door, it goes right down. You told me I could do it with a shinui. You do it with a shinui. I said, no thank you, I'm not doing it with a shinui. But if you do something with a shinui, you're not mechayiv. So this is considered baladai tetzikoladim, even though he says, I don't mind eating it while it's attached to the ground. A normal person does not eat food that's attached to the ground, so therefore he cannot be mechayiv for eating truma as a non-payim. So is that really true that eating something that's still attached is bizarre, and therefore you're not chayiv on it? It was written on the laws of ilfa. Beitzi nevelas ha'if hatar. When someone, as we've come across, there's a special din that a oif a chicken that wasn't shechted, it's matama bebeis habliya. It becomes it's matama person not when he touches it, but when he swallows, when he puts it into his throat, when he eats it. Someone has a dead bird, a dead chicken that wasn't shechted, so it's in a bela, and it was in the process of laying eggs. So miksasa b'chutz miksasa b'pnim, and some of the eggs were still inside this chicken, and some of them were outside. Mi b'fnim mitamim begadim abeis habliya. Those eggs that are still inside the chicken, if you eat the chicken, and inside of it is an egg, and you eat the egg that's really supposed to be separate from the chicken, you eat it together with the chicken, which is very hard to understand because you think it has a shell on it. I don't know how you would eat it. But that's what he did. He chomped right through that egg as it was still in the chicken. So he's going to be tamei for eating a nevela. Basically, it's already out. The egg came out. You never tamei for an egg, even if the chicken that laid it died without a shechita, doesn't all of a sudden become tamei. Right? Otherwise, we get our eggs that come to us, and we could eat them a month later after we get them. In the meantime, in all likelihood, the chicken that gave birth to it already died some grisly death somewhere in the Tyson farms. So, in any case, but that's not really the question. But the problem is the first egg. It was saying Yechayev on it, even though you're eating it while it's still inside of the chicken. We just said it's something that's still attached. It's a shinoi, l'gabe truma. I don't know. To me, eating an egg inside of a chicken is more normal than eating a stalk attached to the ground. And that's what the Gemara answers. So no, Talish avidinish to achli hachi. The Gemara says no. The Gemara says that you can't compare the two cases. People will normally eat grain that's detached, but they won't. But on the other hand, by your egg, it's more likely that people would eat it even when it's still attached. Amar of Turim by Kisla Mashmo has a rare client ba'atzat she'en enough. If someone grows klein, a mixture of, let's say, of some kind of some kind of produce together with grapes, which has a din klein, and he did it in a pot that didn't have a hole. Says it's awesome. So it's also to eat the produce that comes from this growth, even though it wasn't attached to the ground to have the ikar iser of klein. Amar Abaye, Bishlam Yeshminun like the Makas Mardis Rabban and Shapir. If it's coming to tell you that, not that it's awesome, but tell you to get Malkus Midirabana, even though it's not attached to the ground. Midirabana, they were geyser that you're not allowed to do so, and if you get Malkus Midirabana, that would understand. Also, my Kamashlan, the Ran and Havizriya, if it's coming to tell you that Midirabana, when you grow something in an Atzasha in a Nakav, it's considered to have been grown. Like we quoted before, that if you took truma from something that's not nakav on something that is nakav, it's truma because midrabanan it's considered a truma. But yachzer yitra, but you still have to do it again midaraisa. So we know already the rule that something that's grown in an atzah in a nakav in a pot without a hole, that it has a din zriya midrabanan. So what are you being mechadish by me by telling me that it's awesome? Leave it like that. Zakta Mishnah. Hachitin, the wheat, V'asairin and the barley, V'akusmin and the spelt. I feel more familiar with spelt because I had to buy spelt matzahs for a bunch of my family. I have a bunch of kids who decided they want to eat spelt matzahs. It's good for their stomachs. V'hashiboila shoyl and oats, V'hashifan and rye, Hare'elu chayav and b'chalav. These chamisha minim, chayav and chalav. If you make a dough, that's the proper size, you have to separate chalav. Mitzdarf and zemzeh, and they're mitzdarf one with the other. The Gemara is going to explain in what way they are mitzdarf. It means lagabi, you could add them together to some extent to make a shear for different things. V'asurim b'chodesh milifnei ha'oim, change the Pesach to Omer, like the Gemara will be evident why in the Gemara. It's also from chodesh, from before you bring the Omer. Miliksar milifnei ha'Pesach, and you're not allowed to cut it before Pesach. This din of chodesh that we've been talking about, that you can't eat chodesh before you bring the Omer, is really it's a two-part issur. There's an issur that you're not allowed to eat it. There's also an issur that you're not allowed to cut it before the Omer. So we're saying, like it's also chodesh to eat it chodesh before you bring the Omer, and you can't cut it before Pesach, which makes sense if you think about it, because Pesach, on Pesach itself, you obviously can't cut it anyway, because it's Yom Tov, you can't cut anything. Zak the Mishnah. This was referenced earlier in the Gemara. If it took root before the Aimer, matir, and then the Aimer makes it mutter to eat and to cut. And if not, it's also until the next year. You have to wait. Something was planted a day after the Aimer, you got to wait till next year to eat it. Tana. Kusmin min chitim. Kusmin are related to chitim. Kusmin are spelt. Spelt is related to wheat. Shibayla shal v'shifan min sa'irin. And the oats and the rye are related to barley. So, and Rashi explains that even though we said that they're all mitzdaref, there are actually restrictions on it that I mentioned in the Mishnah. I think it's in Chala, that it actually not all of them could combine with others to be mitzdaref, but spelt can combine with wheat and oat, and generally oats and rye can combine with barley, but not all of them can combine with each other. Then the Gemara continues. Kusmin is called gulba in the Lashon Arami. The spelt is called gulba. Shifain, and that's the rye, is called dishra. Shibayla shal, and the oats is called shibayla tala. Talking about honey and iris v'daychem light. These things you're chayiv for. They're subject to the din of Aimer. But iris, which is rice, and daychem, which is millet, I don't know what millet is eaten, but is used for it, but anything other than to feed parakeets. You ever had a bird in your house? They give you millet to feed them. Other than I don't know what use it has. You ever heard of millet? You know what millet is? It's a grain. The only thing I know that you feed it to little birds. Anyway, so these things, they're not subject to Aimer. They're not from the Chumash Minim. We know animili. Where does this come from? Amarish Lakish, Asya lechem matzah. Going back to matzah, Pesach. We learn it out from matzah. It says lechem by matzah, and it says lechem by the Aimer. Legabi the Aimer, when you eat from the lechem aretz. Tzivasam lechem oini. It says legabi matzah lechem oini, and lechem oini, matzah can only be from the Chumash Minim. Lechem, that Aimer also only applies to the Chumash Minim. Bahasam gufa minal. And how do we know that matzah is only from the Chumash Minim? Amar Shlakash v'chein Tanu B'Rei Bishma v'chein Tanu B'Rei Rebbe Elazar ben Yaakov. Amar Kolei Seichel of Chametz v'Yam Teichel of matzah. You shouldn't eat chametz for 7 days. You should eat matzahs instead. Lechem oini. Devarim habarim lidei chimatz adam yotzei b'dei chavasa v'pesach. So therefore, since we compare the matzah to chametz, you say that you should make matzah from the things that would become chametz. So only those things that could become chametz, do you have it in that you can make it matzah? So that excludes rice and millet. Rice is not something that can be leavened. It doesn't rise. It can't be made. I guess it can't be made into a bread. So that excludes rice. That if you try to put it aside and make the sourdough from your rice to rise, it will just spoil. It won't become leavened. Zok the Mishnah, Zok tomorrow. Mitzvah from Zemzeh. We said in the Mishnah that the different types of grains are mitzvah one with another. Tana, atvua, ba'kamachim, ba'betzekas mitzvah. The grain and the flour and the dough are all mitzvah together. Zemzeh, the mayhel. So for what purpose are we saying that they're mitzvah? Rav Kahana le'inyan chadash. The mitzvah, the shear, you have to eat a kazayas of chadash to be over. We're saying if you eat a kazayas that's made up a third of grain and a third of dough and a third of flour, then you're going to be chai. He says the shear of kazayas of chametz on Pesach you can be mitzvah. But Papa Amal in your ma'aser sheni. Technically, you get ma'aser sheni. You get malchus if you have a kazayas made up of a third of grain, a third of flour, and a third of dough. Rava Amal in tumas oichlin. It's coming to tell you that it's mitzvah for the shear of Tumas Oichlim, which is a kabeya, that it could be metama if it's tummy, if it's out Tumas Oichlim. It's coming to tell you that the grain and the flour are similar to the dough. Mahasam uchla beina. Just like over there, it has to be edible. It's coming to tell you they also have to be edible. It's coming so over here now we're saying a whole different vart. We're saying that if you are mitzvah flour and grain to dough, to say that you want it to, you have a kabeya of it, and the question is, can it be metama? It's tumas eichel, and it has to be an eichel. If it's something that can't be eaten by a person, it's not metama. So saying it has to have, it all have to be like the dough. The dough is edible. This also has, these other things also have to be edible. So Tanya, and I'll bring you a raya. Chita, grain, bein klufa, bein she'ena klufa, whether it was peeled, it was shelled, it had the shell taken off of it, or whether it was not shelled, mitzdarfus. It's mitzdarf together to reach the shear of tum. Sa'ira klufa mitzdarfus, she'ena klufa mitzdarfus. But sa'ira, because wheat can be eaten together with its shell. But sa'ira, if it's peeled, then it's mitzdarf, then that sa'ir can be part of the shear to be mitama, to be tumas oichlet, of a beis tumseh. But she'ena klufa, since the shell of barley is not edible, it won't be mitzdarf. Like the more any v'altan be'er bishmal al kol zera zeru asher yizra. The pasuk says, "Yibam nevlasam gabi the tumas nevela." It says that from any planted grain, that it could be whether it's wheat or barley or beans, even in its shell when it's planted, it's going to be metam. We just said that barley, since the shell is not edible, it's not metam. It depends. If it's still moist, then it's edible. Once it dries out, it becomes inedible, and it's no longer able to be mitzdaref to the shear to be mitam. Where do we know the asr from Chodesh? We said we changed it to Lefnei Aimer. We learn out it says lechem lechem. We learn out from matzah. Lixel Lefnei Aimer. Minan Emilia Rav Yechon Asher Reishis Michal. We learn it out from Chal. Okay, we'll stop over here. This starts the next thing to get us all the way to the Mishnah.